part 2 of Venture DAOs, and this is really focused on the Cambrian explosion of Venture DAOs. So we covered 2019 through 2020 last time, and we will cover the explosion of Venture DAOs that happened over the last couple of years. As a reminder, we went over Molok DAO, Metacartel, DAO House, the Lao. These are really some of the foundational organizations for today's Venture DAO movement. But now I want to focus on what people have been able to do with those fundamental frameworks in place. And it's really actually the past year and a half where we've seen a significant amount of activity. Everything from NFT collector DAOs to gaming-focused DAOs to angel investor / alumni affiliation focused DAOs to the next version of Molok DAO. I have a few actual additions to this timeline as well, which happened more recently in March. So I'm actually going to break the timeline, and I think the story of the last 2 years is the emergence of 2 platforms, Tribute Labs and Syndicate. And they've taken 2 somewhat similar, but in some ways different approaches to developing Venture DAO platforms. So Tribute Labs is largely a product of the Lao and Molok DAO version 2. They have taken a bifurcated approach where they incubate branded DAOs, and you can see some of them to the right on the top right of the screen, which focus on everything from DeFi to art to music investments. They have a combined roughly $145 million in Ethereum contributed to these DAOs. A lot of the members of these DAOs are fairly prominent individuals across the NFT crypto space overall. And many of these DAOs are limited to 99 members. And part of that is just due to an overabundance of caution to anticipate any SEC regulations that may come when considering these DAOs as partnerships or investment funds as well. If you look at any investment fund, it's typically limited to 99 LPs. These DAOs are also limiting their participation to accredited investors. And I think that's an opportunity to also help de-risk a lot of what they're doing. Now, Syndicate is a slightly different approach, and Tribute Labs also has a self-serve platform. Before I go to Syndicates, Tribute Labs has Tribute DAO, which is a DAO smart contract platform in open law, which is a means to enable developers to wrap smart contracts in legal agreements. But Syndicate takes a slightly different approach where they're basically allowing for funding of investment clubs. Web3 investment clubs is how they kind of term their product. And basically anybody with a wallet can start a Web3 investment club. So they've made it maybe slightly more democratized to a certain degree. You're still limited to 99 members. They claim to have 850 and above investment clubs that have formed as of a couple of days ago, actually. So anywhere from 10 to 20% of all DAOs that have ever been formed. A couple of the more prominent ones are Komarebi Collective, which is focused on Web3 and diversity investments. I'm not sure what the actual assets under management or contributions that they have are. They haven't been public about that. There's also Superlayer Chainforce. And Chainforce is actually a DAO I'm part of, and Amit Mukherjee, one of the Kernel fellows, started this. It's a Web3 generalist fund, has $10 million contributed. What Tribute Labs helped really drive is collector DAOs. So these are the new Medicis of the world. And I think what you can see, and I see some comments in the chat regarding why 99, well, 99 is typically the limit for a investment fund, number of LPs that can participate in a fund. So if you ever are an LP in a venture fund like a A16Z or the like, they typically limit to 99 participants. This is due to various financial regulations in the space. Going back to collector DAO, so I think this gets really interesting because these are the new Medicis. I mean, you see quite prominent folks on Twitter like Cosimo de Medici, who's affiliated with Snoop Dogg and his various affiliates, talking about the new art curators of the world. And we see a lot of these collector DAOs, which are actually driving financial value. So they're investing in NFTs, typically on-chain art. Fingerprints DAO, for example, has a list of their collection, a lot of autoglyphs, which are on-chain art from Larva Labs. Flamingo, which has claimed to have about $1 billion of realized and unrealized value through their investments in CryptoPunks and Bored Ape Yacht Club. Chromie Squiggle, Squiggle DAO, which is an unofficial way to promote Chromie Squiggle, which is the first art blocks artwork. Pleaser DAO, which is focused on historically significant art, like the Doge. They fractionalized the Doge. They were quite famous for that. And People Pleaser, X times Y equals K, the famous equation behind Uniswap's liquidity pools and AMM, all the way to donated artwork in Muse Zero, which is also one of Tribute Labs offerings. So art is both a collection, but also has some financial value. When we go beyond collector DAOs, we actually start to see affiliation-based DAOs. And I think one of the more interesting ones is called Orange DAO. And this is for YC founders. And you have to be a YC founder. Right now, I think they have about, roughly looking at their Discord server, I think they have about 1,800 plus members. These come with soul-bound, basically non-transferable NFTs. You have to actually prove you're a YC founder to take part in this. But I think what's interesting about this is that they are helping startups get into the YC ecosystem. They're helping to fund these startups pre and post YC. I think they've announced only a handful of investments so far publicly, but I imagine they have a lot more in the works. But imagine if all the other tech and university alumni communities out there actually started to form DAOs. And I think this is where this starts to get really interesting. So imagine a ex-Uber DAO, a Stanford DAO, et cetera. That when you start to think of all these unique affiliations and networks, then there's opportunities for these DAOs to take form. Another very interesting investment DAO that I actually lopped into a separate category is Nouns DAO. And why I think Nouns DAO is interesting is because it focuses on growing their funds. Yeah, that's correct. This is not officially YC backed. And I think one thing that's interesting about Orange DAO, just going back to it, is that it's almost an evolution of Pioneer Fund, which is a fund that YC founders created to invest in their own ecosystem as well, just in DAO format. So I think if you look at a lot of you can actually predict probably what the next DAOs are going to be by looking at angelless syndicates, for example, which are other investment syndicates which have some sort of affiliation basis. Nouns DAO, going back to Nouns DAO, I think the really interesting thing about Nouns DAO is that they're funding their treasury by perpetual NFT one-of-n sales. So they started in August of 2021 by an anonymous figure named 416, originally known as Punk 4156. They auction off one noun every day forever in perpetuity. So far, they've raised $67 million without seeing too much of a reduction in the auction price of a noun. I think the very first auctioned noun was 600 ETH or something in that range. But I think now it's more in the range of 50 to 100 ETH. They have a lot of highly influential members and founders across Web3. So everybody from 416 to Dom Hoffman, who's very famous around his efforts around loot and the like. Gremplin, who's famous around who's gained notoriety around his work around cryptodes and other on-chain art projects that he's done. This is focused on really funding CC0 projects. Basically, think of it as the ability to use the IP freely across different variations and derivatives of the nouns concept, but also funding other projects that are similar to the nouns culture. Corporate brands have bought into this. So Bud Light actually bought it now and featured that in the Super Bowl ad, as you can see on the left. And there's some really interesting concepts like sub-DAOs. So Shark DAO is a sub-DAO that actually bought 5 nouns, I think 5 nouns, and has hundreds of members who control those 5 nouns. And they're almost like a special interest group within the nouns ecosystem. Global coin research is also a very interesting implementation of venture DAOs. And I think this is pointing to the unlocking of angel investor value. So they claim to have over 30,000 members, at least subscribers to their email list. I think much less, a much lower number of members in their actual investment DAO. In order to take part in their deals, you have to own the GCR governance token, which was launched, I believe, late last year. And they actually incentivize deal flow through the GRC governance token as well. They've stated their performance is roughly 16x rate of return on at least the projects that have liquidity and markups, and most of the investments have gone to growth equity startups. The question is really, that I have is like, will all DAOs eventually become venture DAOs? And if you start to think about it, we talked about this last time, FWB, Friends with Benefits. They started off as a social DAO. I think they have about 6,000 plus members now. My guess is that implies a treasury of at least $25 million. I could be off. But they've started to incubate projects. For example, they've created a yerba mate drink line and are starting to invest in other projects across their own member base. If you look at prominent NFT collections like Bored Ape Yacht Club and CryptoPunks, the launch of ApeCoin, this is an opportunity to become an investment DAO. They can invest in each other's projects. If you look at the prominence that individuals who actually have a Bored Ape or a CryptoPunk, that actually adds some credibility to you in crypto Twitter or Web3 investment landscape in general. And you even see this across other chains, not just Ethereum. Monkey DAO, which is formed as part of Solana Monkey Business. I think this is also reflective of the notion that investing is social. So a number of venture funds have actually created programs for angel investors to talk to each other, to learn from investors. So I think there's a natural progression of these venture DAOs from existing DAOs, which ultimately are either social DAOs or NFT collection DAOs or more. What's really interesting is that traditional VCs are starting to add DAOs or start to announce that they're going to become DAOs. So just earlier this month, Bessemer announced $250 million of funding to focus on Web3. But they also created a application gated DAO of operators in the space, and starting to actually think about how that DAO can help with their Web3 focus overall. Later in the month, actually last week, I believe, a former Polychain partner started a $125 billion fund called DAO 5. And the goal is within 3 years to become a DAO. So it's really an experiment of how do you start as a centralized fund and decentralize over time. You're also starting to see venture capitalists start to pass on board seats at this recent Financial Times article in order to win allocation in this really competitive marketplace. I will also say that there are a set of DAOs which are focused on life sciences and climate change and other aspects outside of Web3. So Molecule is a really interesting example of this. It was formed by a Consensus alum and has formed 3 bio DAOs right now. The most prominent of them is Wida DAO, which is focused on funding longevity research with the goal of spinning those off into biotech companies. They also innovated on this term called IP NFTs, basically making the IP an NFT that can be transferred. And finally, let's not forget about Molok DAO. Molok DAO is still around. Molok DAO version 3 was just launched last month. It was formed with the help of the Molok Mystics, which are a large part of the original formation of a lot of the Molok DAOs in the past, Molok DAO frameworks in the past. Their key go-to-market is using DAO House. And I think you're going to start to see many DAOs formed on the heels of Molok DAO version 3. Still too early to tell. But some of the key innovations that they brought are allowing the changing of length of proposal periods, and then the addition of custom smart contracts that are effectively DAO Legos. So Tribute Labs is one of the first to implement this with Tribute DAO, but this allows for a lot more flexibility around reputation governance, transferability, et cetera. So before I go to key questions, I want to mention that I didn't forget about the grant funding. So James Tenley put together a great list of 50+ grant giving organizations across L1 chains and other crypto protocols. This allows for non-dilutive funding across the ecosystem. I'm considering this separate from venture DAOs, but I think it's an interesting opportunity to see how all of these play together in the larger funding ecosystem. So I'm going to stop there, save the last 15, 20 minutes for discussion.